Hello, historians. We're going to be discussing the 1920s era, the Roaring Twenties in Minnesota, and some of the changes that occurred here during the 1920s. And you probably know a little bit about that from movies or other classes, but Minnesota had some interesting things happening uh, here. One, we see the rise of the department stores, and we see this across the country. The department stores started a little bit earlier, but they became very popular during the 1920s. Minnesota had two big department stores, Dayton's and Donaldson's. The name that you probably still remember is Dayton's. When I was a kid, there were Dayton stores all over the place, and then they were bought out by Macy's. And so, anywhere you see a Macy's store, chances are there used to be a Dayton store there. Former Governor Mark Dayton would be one of the heirs from this store, but it started up in Minneapolis. This was the Donaldson store on the corner. Here's the Dayton store up in Minneapolis. And department stores were a little bit different because they had all sorts of things in there. They're like a modern day mall. It was one store, but you could buy lots of different things at the store. And it was kind of like a one stop shop. Think of like a Target or a Walmart. It was the first of its kind where they had things from clothing to jewelry to tools, hardware tools, all sorts of things. Anything you could possibly want was at the store. So this was a place that people flocked to. Now, the original Dayton aimed to forge a bond between his store and the people of Minneapolis. And he kind of looked at it three ways. He said, well, we have to have a lot of good merchandise for the people to come in to buy. He also said, well, maybe we need entertainment. If people aren't going to come in the store to buy anything, but there's something for them to see, they'll come in the store to see that, and then they might end up buying something anyway. So just get them in the doors. And then the third part was philanthropy. He wanted to work with the community and start giving back. And so they offered a wide variety of stuff from tools to high fashion. They also had a generous return policy where if you bought something, you could bring it back. They also had different exhibits, flower exhibits, where you could see flowers from all over the world. Today, we might say, I'm not going to go in a store and see that. But in the 1920s, that was interesting. They had Christmas extravaganzas. Even when I was a little kid, maybe ask your parents too, but when I was a kid, we'd go up there and they had a Christmas exhibit set up every year. And so, of course, when we'd go watch that or go up to see that, I'm sure my mom did some shopping as well. Fashion shows, and they also started the Dayton Foundation in 1918, which helped out different groups in Minneapolis. So this was kind of a big, a destination for people in Minneapolis or from around the state. The building is still there. It's gotten a facelift. They're currently, as we speak, remodeling the building and turning it into some new stuff. I think this is a link to their website. It is not going to be just one store. Actually, this was a link about a mummified monkey that they found there. There used to be big pet store. Let's see here. Here's the Dayton's project, and they're gonna try to create a wide variety of things at this. It's gonna be lots of different stores. There's probably going to be some offices in there where people will be conducting business. They're thinking there's going to be a restaurant, there's going to be a gym to work out, there's going to be some different stores. So the idea is to have a lot of different things in that building, which previously wasn't really being used for anything. Where was Dayton's department store located? Where's the Dayton project currently located? Well, to give you an idea, here's where the Vikings play, US Bank Stadium. Here's where the Twins play at Target Field, Timberwolves Target Center. It's kind of in between those. So if you're driving east and west, here's where, here's the Guthrie Theater. Here's Mill City Museum. So You'd come up 35, exit, drive over here. Actually, here's 35, exit, downtown, take a left. Probably Dayton's biggest legacy is eventually they started the Target store, and there's over 1,800 Targets across the country. What was coming into the cities by 1920, most buildings in the cities had indoor plumbing as well as electricity. If you lived in rural areas, you were going to have to wait a while. Probably like farms and things like that didn't really start getting electricity and plumbing until maybe the 1950s or 60s at the latest. And so by then, most farms and stuff had it, but the cities had it first. And so that was new. Spectator sports. People at this point are having more free time. They're having more disposable income. And so one of the things that they would do is go spend it on watching sports. Boxing was very big at this time. Pro football was just getting going. It was not anywhere close to where it is today. Minnesota had a bunch of pro teams that paid their players. The Minneapolis Marines were the first professional team. The Duluth Eskimos might have been the most famous. They had a couple of Hall of Famers, Ernie Nevers and John McNally. They called him Blood McNally. He also coached at St. John's for a while. St. John's football that's had a heck of a run since the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and today. When John Blood McNally left and he told the new guy coming in, John Gagliardi, he said, nobody can win at St. John's. And then Gagliardi became the winningest football coach in the history of the game. But he was a heck of a player for the Duluth Eskimos. Now, that was a time when pro football, they were lucky to get 100 or 200 fans at a game. Then you go to a college football game, and they might have 50, 60,000 people there. Here was where the Gophers played, Memorial Stadium right on campus. And they could hold up to 52,000, and they filled it week after week. And so in the 1920s, the Golden Gopher football was a huge deal. Here you can see a photograph of Memorial Stadium. The original entrance where you'd walk through the gates is still around. They kept it. It's sitting in the McNamara Center up at the U. This maybe was one of the greatest players of the 1920s, not just in Minnesota, but anywhere. His name was Bronco Nagurski. He played for the Gophers from 1927 to 1929. Back in those days, freshmen were not allowed to play. While he was on the team, they went 18-4 with 2 ties, and they won the Big Ten Conference Championship in 1927. And so here's Bronco Nagurski. Today, there is an award named after Bronco Nagurski. And so when they're handing out like the Heisman Award, they'll also hand out the Bronco Nagurski Award. Bronco Nagurski was from International Falls. So I knew some people up there that were, when I was teaching up there, that are related to Bronco Nagurski. There's a museum up there that you can go see. And their nickname, their mascot up there, are the Broncos. Bronco did not want it named after him, so they didn't put a K there, and they have the bucking bronco horse, but it's named after him, all right. Besides football, one thing we see that's also new at the University of Minnesota is Williams Arena, built in 1928. It's one of the unusual college basketball arenas in that it has a raised floor. So you could kind of fall off if you got too close, but there's a lot of gaps there. If you've been to Williams Arena, you probably realize that, yes, it does feel like it was built in 1928. We also had some minor league baseball teams here. The Minneapolis Millers and the St. Paul Saints were big rivals. They played over a dozen times a year. At times, the Millers had a lot of future Major League Baseball players playing for them. They supported the Red Sox from in the 1930s and 50s, and the New York Giants for a little bit in the 40s and 50s. And so they were a farm club for those pro teams. but they were a minor league team. They had good players, some that were dreaming of making it to the majors. And the Millers, why did they get the name Millers? There was a lot of milling going on in Minneapolis. Some guys that played for the Millers over the years: Willie Mays, who's a Hall of Famer; Ted Williams, who's a Hall of Famer. Ted Williams, while he was here, really got into hunting and fishing, and I believe he married a girl from Princeton, Minnesota. And for years and years and years, he used to come back to Princeton and deer hunt and go fishing and stuff like that. St. Paul Saints were also a farm club for the White Sox and Dodgers. You had guys like Duke Schneider that played for them. I'll have this video later on a little bit of town ball stuff. Also new in the 20s, brand names. We're starting to see it for the first time where companies are like, okay, we're not just going to be a regional product. We're going to sell our product all over the country, and people are going to recognize it. And we saw this already a little bit with our flower industry in our state. Pillsbury's Best, which is still around today. Gold Medal Flour, which is still around today. Were brands that people knew exactly what to expect when they saw that brand in a store. Quaker Oats was a new one. You can kind of see the old Quaker Oats casing. Burma Shave was a shaving cream that was started in Minneapolis in 1925 to give people a good clean shave. And they started to put up these signs. And it might be a sign that, is every half mile or quarter mile. But it was the Burma Shave series, and they first started putting up along Highway 65 near Lakeville. And an example might be, now these are close together, but an example is, said Farmer Brown. Then you drive another half mile, who's bald. Then you drive another half mile, on top, wish I could, rotate the crop, Burma Shave. And so people were curious as they were reading these rhymes or riddles or whatever they are, the saying, okay, what's coming, and then at the end, Burma Shave. And so they're using this basically as the first ever billboard to sell their products. And they start popping up all over the country. Remember 1920s Prohibition. You cannot go buy alcohol anywhere. Soda fountains became popular. These were places you could go. You could get ice cream, you could get candy, you could get soda pop, and they became very popular for all people. The guy that was making the root beer floats and serving you everything, he was called a soda jerk. Now, a little bit of politics in the 1920s. We talked about how the nonpartisan league is going to fall apart, but it turns into the Farmer Labor Party. And the Farmer Labor Party is going to become a huge influence in the state. It's bigger than the Democratic Party, and it's equal with the Republican Party. So we have three parties once again: Republicans, Democrats, and Farmer Labor. The Farmer Labor Party was created in 1922, and it was trying to kind of combine your farmers in the country with your laborers in the city. And they make some noise right away. Henrik Shipstead was a dentist from Glenwood in 1922 that was elected to the U.S. Senate, and he served there for over 20 years. And what made the Farmer Labor Party dangerous and powerful was that you could be a Democrat and switch over to Farmer Labor. You could be a Republican and switch over to Farmer Labor. And so they were drawing from both political parties. Magnus Johnson was another unique senator that came out of the Farmer Labor Party. He was from Dassel, Minnesota. One of the first things he did when he got to Washington, D.C., is he challenged the Secretary of Agriculture to a milking contest, which made big news to see who could milk their cows the fastest. He actually gets kind of caused some trouble and mysteriously got hit by a car and killed. And so he dies young, and some people thought, well, maybe somebody did it on purpose. A big policy that was changed in our state legislature was the Babcock Amendment, which said that the state would start building highways. up until the 1920s, they basically left it up to each individual county on paying and building their roads. And keep in mind, before the 1920s, most people were riding horses still. Very few people had cars, or people were walking. But by the 1920s, more and more people were getting cars. We needed roads. Well, there was a law that had been passed originally in our state constitution that basically said that our state was not going to tax individual counties or towns in order to pay for statewide projects. Well, that all changes when they need to start building these roads. And so they start building the roads in the 1920s across our state so you can get places. We needed good roads. Some innovations and products that start off in the 20s. Well, Honeywell's created, starting off as a heating and refrigeration company, fans and stuff like that they're putting together. Probably what they become most known for, besides cooling off and heating buildings, is in the 40s, they start making these round thermostats to control the temperature. And you've probably seen these in homes, especially older homes. But that's Honeywell. Another company that really starts to grow in the 1920s is the Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing Company that started in Two Harbors. They started making sandpaper, where they created this chemical where they could kind of get that sand or rocks or whatever's on sandpaper to stick to it. And then eventually, though, what makes them very famous is tape. Basically kind of like that painting tape, where there was a guy in the going around selling sandpaper to like car detailing or places where they painted cars or fixed up cars in the shops, in the garages, and the mechanics sometimes that were fixing the body of a car were like, we need some type of tape that we can kind of put on there but won't peel the paint off. And that was the first tape that was invented. What becomes even more popular after that is Scotch tape, which is what they're kind of known for today. And so 3M, Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing, becomes a very important company in Minnesota and still is today. Wheaties, General Mills is making them. They started putting some of the big stars on there. Lou Gehrig was the first baseball player to appear on a Wheaties box. Babe Ruth over here. Betty Crocker, we saw this in our Flower Power video, was also created in the 1920s, and she's still around today on the different products in the cookbooks. Remember, Betty Crocker, though, was a fictional character. She was not real, even though lots of people thought she was. Green Giant's going to start in the 1920s. There was a company down in Le Sueur called the Minnesota Valley Canning Company, and they weren't sure about a new type of pea that they were growing. It was a big pea. It's like the peas we think about today, but back then they had smaller peas, and they weren't sure people would like these really big peas. So they said, we're not going to put them in our own cans. We're going to put them in cans that are called Green Giant. And people really like these Green Giant peas. And eventually the whole company just changes its name to Green Giant. And Green Giant obviously still around today. You can find it in stores all over the world. I've talked to foreign exchange students. They're like, oh yeah, we got Green Giant in our stores. If you're driving down the road into Le Sueur on 169, you can see the Green Giant statue. Or not statue, but big bulletin board. Welcome to the valley. You can go down to like Blue Earth and see the big Green Giant statue. I think they also have one. Well, they have a few out there, but I know they have one in Blue Earth. If you go to Le Sueur today, what's their mascot? The Giants, because of Green Giant. Anoka in the 1920s became the Halloween capital of the world. It used to be on Halloween, adults went to Halloween parties, kids went out and wrecked stuff. And so they thought, how can we get these kids to stop going out and wrecking things on Halloween? And they decide they're going to have a parade. And this is before people started handing out candy and stuff like that. So they said, we're going to turn it into we're going to have a parade. We're going to have things for the kids to do. And lo and behold, the next day there was nothing wrecked, so they kept him busy. And so in 1920, they started this out, and Anoka's claim to fame is the Halloween capital of the world. Look at that roundabout. We need roundabouts like that. This was also the age of heroes and some famous people. Sinclair Lewis was a famous author from Minnesota. He was from Sauk Centre. And during the 1920s, he wrote some very famous books. He wrote Main Street, which maybe wasn't his most famous, but it kind of is in Minnesota because it was about Sauk Centre. He basically wrote about Sauk Centre but changed the name to Gopher Prairie. And people were reading the book going, hey, he's talking about so-and-so, but he changed the name. Or he's talking about this place, but he changed the name. And basically he made Minnesota or small-town America seem boring and uneducated and uncultured. But people kind of liked it. He did win a Nobel Prize for his book Dodsworth. So he's a very famous writer from Minnesota. Here is Sauk Centre way up here, just northwest of St. Cloud. And if you drive up there, they've got the original Main Street, is what they call it, that he was writing about, the old Gopher Prairie Inn. And their mascot are the Main Streeters, which when I was growing up, I used to think, Sauk Centre Main Streeters, what a dumb name, but it's from the book. F. Scott Fitzgerald, some of you have read the book The Great Gatsby, or you've watched the movie The Great Gatsby. He was from Minnesota, and he was, they think, when he started writing The Great Gatsby for the first time and putting little stories together, he was living in St. Paul. And you can actually go around and look at some of the different places in St. Paul where F. Scott Fitzgerald lived. We have a statue of him there. This isn't far from the Xcel Energy Center. There's the Fitzgerald Theater right around the corner there, not far from the X. Summit Avenue, where he lived quite a bit. And then lastly, you remember Charles Lindbergh Sr., who was the nonpartisan league politician running for governor, but his son, 10 years later, becomes a famous pilot, and there was a competition. Who could be the first person to fly across the Atlantic solo? And people had tried, and people had died. But Charles Lindbergh Jr. does it successfully in 1927, and he wins a $25,000 prize, which was a lot of money back then. He grew up and lived a lot in Little Falls, Minnesota, especially in the summer months. And they are nicknamed the Flyers after Charles Lindbergh because he was a flyer. And he becomes a huge hero. That's a little bit about Minnesota in the 1920s.